The restaurant hummed with the soft clatter of plates and the muted murmurs of conversations, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and fine wine. Sophia moved swiftly between the tables, her uniform crisp, her expression neutral, as she served dish after dish to patrons who barely glanced her way. To them, she was part of the background, a figure of service, nothing more. But behind her calm demeanor, Sophia was always watching, listening. The restaurant, Bristol's Elite, was a place for the powerful, a sanctuary for politicians, business moguls, and the city's upper crust. Tonight, however, the stakes were higher than usual. In the corner booth, shielded from the rest of the dining room by tall, velvet curtains, sat Mr. Kane and Senator Thompson. The tension between them was palpable, though Sophia doubted anyone else noticed. She had learned a lot in the 2 years she had worked here, not just about the rich dishes she carried from the kitchen, but about the power plays and backdoor deals whispered over wine glasses. The restaurant was a theater, and the patrons were its actors, pretending that the world outside didn't exist while plotting its future. Sophia had never planned to work in a restaurant like this. She had studied political science, dreaming of a career that made a difference. But life had taken a different path. A family emergency, student loans, and the lack of connections forced her to take this job. Yet, she never stopped paying attention. Tonight was no different. She had seen Senator Thompson here before, always hesitant, always cautious. But Mr. Kane was another story. A businessman with deep pockets and even deeper connections, he was known for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Sophia had heard rumors about him, about the communities his projects destroyed, the livelihoods ruined in the name of profit. And now, he was trying to pull Senator Thompson into one of his plans. As she approached their table, balancing 2 delicate wine glasses on her tray, she could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Something significant was happening. Mr. Kane leaned forward, his voice low, but clear enough for her to catch a few words. "And with your backing, Senator, we can push this through before anyone realizes what's happening." Her steps slowed as she neared the booth, her heart racing. What was Mr. Kane planning? And why did it feel like whatever it was wrong? Sophia placed the glasses in front of the men, offering a polite smile. Neither man acknowledged her presence, their focus entirely on the conversation. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary, her ears straining to catch more, but Mr. Kane's voice dipped into a whisper. With a final glance, she moved away, her mind spinning. Something big was happening, and for the first time, Sophia felt like she couldn't just stand by and watch. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of orders and service, but Sophia's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that what she had overheard was important, possibly dangerous. Every time she passed the corner booth, her eyes darted to Mr. Kane and Senator Thompson, but they remained engrossed in their private conversation, oblivious to her presence. As the dinner wound down, Sophia watched from the far side of the room as the men stood to leave. Mr. Kane clasped Senator Thompson's shoulder in what seemed like a friendly gesture, but the senator's expression remained uncertain. She knew that look. He was on the fence about something, and Mr. Kane was pushing him hard. Sophia's gut twisted. She had learned enough from her time at the restaurant to know when something was off, and tonight had been no exception. The way Mr. Kane had spoken, the urgency in his tone, made her believe this wasn't just another business deal. It was something bigger. As the men exited the restaurant, Sophia returned to the kitchen, her mind racing. Should she do something? Say something? She wasn't in a position to challenge someone like Mr. Kane. But if she stayed silent and something terrible happened, could she live with that? Her shift was almost over when her manager approached, handing her an envelope. "Sophia, Mr. Kane left this for you," he said, raising an eyebrow in curiosity before walking away. She stared at the envelope in her hand, her name written in bold black ink. Curious, she slipped the note out of the envelope. It was short, and her heart sank as she read it. "You seem to be paying too much attention to things that don't concern you. Be careful." Sophia's blood ran cold. How had Mr. Kane noticed her? She had been discreet, hadn't she? But the note was a clear warning, and it confirmed her fears. She had been right to be suspicious. Whatever Mr. Kane was planning, it wasn't good. And now, she was part of it. As she finished her shift, her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so conflicted. On one hand, the note had shaken her. Mr. Kane was powerful, and getting involved could be dangerous. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore what she had overheard. She knew too much now. She stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. This wasn't just about serving tables anymore. She had a choice to make: stay quiet and protect herself, or speak up and risk everything. The next morning, Sophia's alarm blared, dragging her from a restless sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind. The envelope, the note, Mr. Kane's voice whispering about secret deals. It all gnawed at her. She had wanted to believe that maybe she was overthinking things, but the note confirmed her worst fears. Still, as she dressed and prepared for another shift at the restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into dangerous territory. Mr. Kane had noticed her, and now she felt like there were eyes on her wherever she went. Arriving at Bristol's Elite, the atmosphere was the same as ever, glamorous, polished, and detached from the reality outside its doors. But to Sophia, everything felt different now. She moved through the motions, setting tables, prepping orders, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Her anxiety spiked as she saw Mr. Kane enter the restaurant again, this time alone. He moved with the confidence of a man who owned the place, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the booth in the corner. Sophia felt a cold sweat forming on her palms, but she forced herself to keep moving, trying to appear as normal as possible. As she approached to take his order, Mr. Kane's eyes met hers. There was a brief flicker of recognition, followed by a slow, deliberate smile. He ordered a coffee, his tone casual, but the weight of his gaze felt anything but. "Interesting night, wasn't it?" he said, his voice low and smooth, as she placed the coffee before him. Sophia's heart raced. She tried to keep her hands steady, but her pulse was deafening in her ears. She forced a polite smile, nodding slightly without making eye contact. "I didn't realize serving tables gave one so much insight into business matters," he added, his tone edged with warning. Sophia froze for a second before catching herself. Her mind raced, scrambling for an appropriate response, but nothing came. She could feel his eyes boring into her, testing her resolve, waiting for her to make a mistake. Before she could reply, another figure entered the room, Senator Thompson. His arrival broke the tension, and Mr. Kane's attention shifted, but not before he gave her one last, pointed look. As the senator joined Mr. Kane at the table, Sophia moved away, her body trembling slightly from the tension. She knew now that she couldn't simply ignore what was happening. Mr. Kane wasn't just hinting. He was reminding her that she was a small piece in a much larger game, and one misstep could cost her. From a distance, Sophia kept an eye on the men as they resumed their discussion. She couldn't hear everything, but the snippets she caught were enough to confirm that the deal they were discussing would have devastating consequences for a community on the outskirts of town. A housing project, masquerading as a public benefit, was really just a means for Mr. Kane to acquire the land and evict the current residents. Sophia's blood boiled as she realized the depth of Mr. Kane's deceit. The deal would destroy lives, displace families, and leave the senator complicit in it all. She couldn't stand by any longer. Sophia's hands trembled as she returned to the kitchen, replaying the conversation she had overheard. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and frustration. Mr. Kane was orchestrating something terrible, and if the senator agreed, it would set the plan in motion. But who was she really? A server at a restaurant. What could she possibly do to stop it? The sound of clattering dishes snapped her back to the present. Her co-workers moved around her, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her mind. She wanted to speak up, to tell someone, anyone, about what she had heard. But how could she? Who would believe her? And more importantly, what would it cost her? She found herself confiding in James, a fellow server she had known for months. He was older, steady, and one of the few people she trusted. As they stood in the kitchen during a brief lull in the evening rush, she hesitated before finally telling him about the note, about what Mr. Kane was planning. James listened carefully, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sophia, this sounds serious," he said, his voice low. "But are you sure you want to get involved? Kane's not the kind of guy who plays fair." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But if I don't, who will? Senator Thompson might not realize what he's getting into." James sighed, leaning against the counter. "Look, I get it, but you need to be careful. These guys, they don't play by the same rules as us. You don't want to get caught in the crossfire." Sophia bit her lip, torn between the need to act and the fear of what it could mean for her future. The warning in Mr. Kane's note still echoed in her mind. Be careful. Was she willing to risk her job, her safety, to stop this deal? She returned to the floor, her thoughts still swirling. Every time she passed by the booth, her eyes flicked toward Mr. Kane and Senator Thompson. The conversation was quieter now, the tension between the men palpable. The senator seemed hesitant, his body language rigid, his responses measured. Mr. Kane, on the other hand, was smooth, persuasive, and relentless. It was clear that he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. As the evening wore on, the decision gnawed at her. She could feel the weight of it pressing down, suffocating her. Every fiber of her being screamed to act, to do something, but fear held her back. What if she made things worse? What if her actions only solidified Mr. Kane's grip on the senator? By the end of her shift, Sophia was no closer to a decision. She stood in the break room, staring blankly at the locker in front of her, the weight of the situation bearing down on her like a storm cloud. "I can't just ignore this," she whispered to herself, the words sounding hollow even to her ears. "But what if? What if I'm too late?" The next few days felt like a blur to Sophia. The restaurant remained as busy as ever, with guests coming and going, clinking glasses and whispered conversations echoing in the dimly lit dining room. But for her, each shift carried the weight of indecision. The tension of a moment she had overheard still hung heavy in her mind, and Mr. Kane's warning note was a constant reminder of the danger lurking behind his smooth demeanor. Sophia spent hours agonizing over what she had witnessed and overheard. She could see the faces of the people who would be affected by Mr. Kane's deal. Families displaced, homes destroyed, communities shattered. She had seen it before, in the news, and in her political studies. She had always promised herself she wouldn't be one of the bystanders who watched injustice unfold and did nothing. But the fear was real. What if she was overstepping her place? What if she lost her job, or worse, if Mr. Kane retaliated? The man had connections far beyond her world. He could make her life difficult in ways she couldn't even imagine. Every scenario that played out in her mind ended in disaster, but something deeper gnawed at her, the voice that kept whispering that she couldn't stay silent. On her day off, Sophia took a walk through the city. She wandered through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, seeing families walking together, children playing in the park, elderly couples chatting on benches. These were the kinds of people who would be affected by Mr. Kane's deal. The decision weighed heavier on her with every step. By the time she returned home, the decision was clear in her mind. She couldn't stay silent. The consequences of doing nothing felt more terrifying than any personal risk she might face. Even if her voice was small, it still mattered. Later that evening, she returned to the restaurant for her shift, but this time with a different sense of purpose. She was ready. As she moved through the restaurant, she watched Mr. Kane, waiting for the right moment to approach him. She had no real plan, but something in her had shifted. Her fear was still there, but it was now tempered by a sense of moral urgency. Toward the end of the evening, she saw her chance. Mr. Kane sat at his usual table, sipping a glass of red wine as he wrapped up yet another hushed conversation with a business associate. Sophia steadied her nerves, took a deep breath, and approached the table. "Mr. Kane," she said softly as she placed his bill on the table. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized her. "Yes." His tone was sharp, cold. "I just wanted to say, you should reconsider that deal you've been pushing." Her voice was quiet but firm. "It's not just about profit. People are going to be hurt." For a moment, Mr. Kane said nothing, just stared at her with a look of incredulity. Then, slowly, a A smile crept across his face, a dangerous, mocking smile. He set his glass down and leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You really think you know more about this than I do, don't you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your server, Sophia. You bring me coffee and clean up after my meals. Don't pretend you understand the complexities of business." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had expected this reaction, but it didn't make the moment any easier. "Maybe I don't understand everything, but I do know this deal is wrong, and I won't stay silent." Mr. Kane's eyes flashed with anger. "I warned you to keep your nose out of things that don't concern you," he hissed. "This is your final warning." Sophia swallowed, fear crawling up her spine, but she held her ground. "I can't stay silent," she repeated. Without another word, Mr. Kane stood, threw some money on the table, and stormed out of the restaurant. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, the weight of what she had just done crashing over her. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. Sophia didn't have much time to dwell on her confrontation with Mr. Kane. The next morning, she was summoned to a private meeting room at the restaurant. Her manager had informed her in hushed tones that Senator Thompson had requested to speak with her. The news left her both anxious and curious. She arrived at the room to find the senator sitting alone at a small table, looking as though he hadn't slept well. His brow furrowed when he saw her, and he gestured for her to sit. "I heard you had an interesting conversation with Mr. Kane last night," Senator Thompson said, his voice weary but curious. Sophia nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she began, "but I've overheard things. Things that concern me. About the deal." The senator's eyes studied her, calculating whether to take her seriously. "You've been paying attention." "I have," she replied firmly. "And I know this deal will hurt people. I know you don't want to be part of that." The senator sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand how complicated these things are. Sometimes, compromises have to be made, even if they're uncomfortable." Sophia leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet intensity. "I understand that, but this isn't just a compromise. It's exploitation. People will lose their homes. Families will be uprooted. You know it, and I know it." For a moment, the senator said nothing, and the room was thick with tension. Then he leaned back, exhaling deeply. "You're right," he admitted. "I've had my doubts about this from the beginning. But Mr. Kane, he's not someone you cross lightly." Sophia nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "But if you do nothing, you're no better than him. You can stop this before it's too late." Senator Thompson looked at her, something shifting in his expression. There was a weariness there, but also a spark of something, maybe conviction, or perhaps the stirring of a conscience long buried under political maneuvering. He nodded slowly. "You're brave to speak up, Sophia. I don't know if I can stop this on my own, but maybe there's something we can do?" Sophia's heart raced. She had hoped to plant a seed of doubt, but she hadn't expected the senator to consider action so quickly. "I'm willing to help in any way I can," she said earnestly. Senator Thompson stood, offering his hand. "I'll need more information. We can't take him down with just suspicion. But if you're serious about stopping this, we'll need evidence. Real evidence." Sophia nodded, shaking his hand, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had crossed a line, one she couldn't uncross. But for the first time, she felt that there was a real chance to make a difference. As she left the room, she realized just how dangerous the road ahead was. Mr. Kane wouldn't take this lightly, and if they failed, the consequences could be dire. But for now, she had something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The restaurant buzzed with its usual activity, but for Sophia, everything felt different now. She had crossed a line that most wouldn't dare, and the consequences were beginning to creep in. Her confrontation with Mr. Kane had been reckless, and she knew it. Even now, as she moved through her shift, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some curious, some worried. Word had spread that she had stood up to Mr. Kane, and the weight of that moment settled heavily on her shoulders. In the days that followed, Mr. Kane didn't return to Bristol's elite, but his absence didn't offer Sophia much relief. Every time she glanced at the entrance, Her pulse quickened, half expecting him to walk in and retaliate. But the real storm was brewing elsewhere. Senator Thompson's mood had shifted as well. He had become more distant, more cautious. There was a subtle tension in his posture whenever he arrived at the restaurant, and the air between him and Mr. Kane's usual circle of business associates had grown colder. Sophia wondered if her actions had tipped something in the senator's mind, if perhaps he was trying to figure out how to move forward without causing too much damage to his political standing. But Mr. Kane's reach went far beyond the senator. As Sophia continued working, she began noticing strange things: whispers in the kitchen, brief glances from other staff, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. It wasn't long before James, her trusted colleague, approached her during a break. "Sophia, I don't want to alarm you," he began, leaning in with a lowered voice, "but you need to watch your back. People are talking, and I've heard rumors that Mr. Kane is trying to make things difficult for you." Sophia's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I heard he's been spreading rumors about you, questioning your integrity, making it seem like you're not trustworthy. He has connections everywhere, Sophia. If he wants to ruin you, he can." Sophia's mind raced. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. Mr. Kane wasn't just a businessman. He was a man with power, and he wasn't above using it to crush those who got it his way. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, feeling a wave of fear and helplessness wash over her. James sighed. "You've already started something, and you can't stop now. But be careful. This isn't just about you anymore. If he can't destroy you directly, he'll find another way." Sophia nodded, her throat tight. She couldn't back down, but the stakes had risen. Mr. Kane's influence was vast, and he was clearly willing to use it to protect his interests. But she had already taken the first step by speaking to Senator Thompson, and now there was no turning back. If she didn't see this through, the consequences for the community and for her own conscience would be worse than any personal fallout. As her shift ended, she left the restaurant with her thoughts swirling. Mr. Kane had begun his retaliation, and she knew it was only going to get worse. She had made an enemy of a man who held power in the palm of his hand, and now she had to figure out how to navigate the storm that was coming her way. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Every time Sophia walked into the restaurant, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Her colleagues had become more distant, some avoiding her altogether. Whispers followed her every move, and the pressure was suffocating. It was clear that Mr. Kane's campaign to ruin her had already begun. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Sophia continued to push forward. She had to. If she backed down now, everything she had worked for, everything she had tried to protect, would be lost. But the strain was beginning to show. Her hand shook slightly as she carried trays, and her mind was constantly racing, trying to stay one step ahead of whatever Mr. Kane might do next. It wasn't long before the rumors started to affect her work. Her manager, a middle-aged man who had always been fair, called her into his office one evening after her shift. "Sophia, we need to talk," he said, his tone heavy with concern. She took a seat, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is something wrong?" he sighed, leaning forward on his desk. "I've been hearing things. From customers, from staff. Rumors about you. It seems that Mr. Kane is unhappy with you, and he's been spreading some rather troubling accusations." Sophia swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," he said quickly. "At least, I don't believe you did. But Mr. Kane is a powerful man, and when someone like him spreads rumors, people listen. It's affecting the restaurant's reputation, and I'm under pressure to address it." Fear clawed at her throat. "What are you saying?" Her manager looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. "I'm not saying I'm going to fire you, Sophia, but I need you to keep your head down for a while. Don't get involved in anything more than you already have. This situation is bigger than just you, and I can't have the restaurant caught in the middle of it." Sophia felt the weight of his words. Keep her head down. Stay quiet. It was the same advice she had been hearing from everyone, but was the opposite of what her gut was telling her to do. She couldn't stay quiet. Not now. Not when there was so much at stake. I understand, she said quietly, though her heart screamed otherwise. Her manager gave her a small nod, as if relieved that the conversation was over. Good. Just be careful, Sophia. I don't want to see you get hurt. That night, as Sophia walked home through the dimly lit streets, the full weight of the situation pressed down on her. Mr. Kane was actively trying to ruin her reputation, and he was succeeding. But there was more to this than just her. If she stayed quiet, if she followed her manager's advice, Mr. Kane would win. The deal would go through, and countless families would be displaced. Sophia stopped in front of her apartment, staring up at the darkened windows. She was at a crossroads. Stay silent, protect herself, and let injustice win, or continue to fight, knowing the risks would only grow. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Senator Thompson's number. He answered on the second ring. "Senator, it's Sophia," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We need to move forward. We need to find the evidence to stop this." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the senator's voice came through, firm and resolved. "I've been thinking the same thing, Sophia. It's time to take action." As she hung up the phone, a sense of determination settled over her. She had made her choice. There was no going back now. The day after her conversation with Senator Thompson, Sophia felt a new sense of determination, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her. Mr. Kane's threats were real, and the consequences of opposing him were growing more apparent. Yet, as she prepared for her shift at the restaurant, she knew that standing up for what was right had to outweigh her fears. Sophia arrived early at Bristol's Elite, trying to avoid drawing attention. Her goal was simple: stay focused, keep her head down during the shift, and wait for the senator's next move. It had been only a day since their phone call, but the wheels were in motion. As the evening unfolded, the familiar clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversations filled the restaurant. Sophia moved quietly between tables, her mind racing with thoughts about how to gather evidence. She had no idea where to start, but she knew she wasn't alone in this anymore. Senator Thompson had become an unexpected ally, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Midway through the evening, as Sophia cleared a table, she noticed the senator walking in, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. He nodded subtly as he was seated in the back corner, away from prying eyes. Sophia's heart raced as she approached his table, keeping her expression neutral. She poured him a glass of water and, as quietly as possible, asked, "Do you have a plan?" Senator Thompson leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been looking into Mr. Kane's other business dealings. There are patterns: corruption, bribery, backdoor deals. If we can find one piece of concrete evidence that ties him to illegal activity, we can stop the deal before it moves forward." Sophia nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "How can I help?" The senator looked around cautiously before responding. "There are documents. Kane's people keep them hidden, but I've heard rumors that they're stored in the private office he uses when meeting clients at this restaurant. If we could get access to that office and find something, we'd have a chance." Sophia felt her pulse quicken. The private office was in the back of the restaurant, always locked, and only used by high-profile guests like Mr. Kane. Getting inside would be risky, but it might be the only way to gather the evidence they needed. "I'll see what I can do," she whispered, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Before the senator could say more, Mr. Kane himself walked into the restaurant, his presence casting a shadow over the room. He spotted Senator Thompson and gave him a sharp nod, but his eyes flickered towards Sophia, a cold smile forming on his lips. She quickly excused herself, feeling the tension between them grow. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of nerves and strategic glances. Sophia tried to stay calm, but the weight of what she and the senator were planning made every interaction with Mr. Kane feel like a potential disaster waiting to happen. As the night came to a close and the restaurant emptied, Sophia stood near the back, watching the last few guests leave. Mr. Kane lingered longer than usual, chatting with one of his associates before finally exiting. It was only then that Sophia felt her shoulders relax. Now, she had to act. The next day, Sophia arrived at the restaurant with a plan forming in her mind. She had to find a way into the private office and retrieve whatever documents could expose Mr. Kane's corruption. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. That afternoon, as she prepared for her shift, Sophia was approached by James, the colleague she had confided in days earlier. His face was serious, his eyes filled with concern. "Sophia, I've been thinking," he began quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "If you're going through with this, you're going to need help. Getting into Kane's office, that's not something you can do by yourself." Sophia looked at him, surprised by the sudden offer of support. "You're willing to help?" James nodded. "Look, I've been here a long time. I've seen the kind of people Kane associates with, and I know how he operates. You're right to want to stop him. If there's anything I can do to help, I'm in." Sophia's chest tightened with relief and gratitude. She had expected to be alone in this fight, but knowing that James was on her side gave her a renewed sense of strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone else would understand." James smiled faintly. "I've been in this business long enough to know what's right and what's wrong. And Kane, he's all kinds of wrong." They quickly hashed out a plan. James knew the inner workings of the restaurant better than anyone and had a good idea of when the private office would be empty. They would wait until the end of the night, after the restaurant had closed, to make their move. That evening, Sophia worked her shift with a quiet determination, knowing that something bigger was waiting for her after hours. Mr. Kane was scheduled to meet with a client in the office, but by the end of the night, the room would be empty and hopefully accessible. As the final guests left and the restaurant began to wind down, James signaled to Sophia. "It's now or never," he whispered. Sophia nodded, her heart racing. She followed James through the back corridors of the restaurant until they reached the locked door of the private office. The lights inside were off, but the faint hum of electronics indicated that the room wasn't entirely dormant. James knelt down, pulling out a set of lock-picking tools he had acquired from a friend in security. "I'll get this open," he muttered, concentrating on the task at hand. Sophia kept watch, her pulse thudding in her ears. Every creak and shift in the restaurant made her tense, as if Mr. Kane might appear at any moment to catch them in the act. But after a few tense minutes, James gave a soft click of satisfaction. The door swung open. "Got it," he whispered. Sophia stepped inside the darkened office, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was meticulously organized, with expensive leather chairs, polished wooden desks, and filing cabinets lining the walls. It was clear that this was a space where important and secretive business was conducted. She moved toward the filing cabinets, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled open one of the drawers. Inside were stacks of documents, neatly labeled and filed. She rifled through them, searching for anything that might connect Mr. Kane to his corrupt dealings. "Look for anything related to the housing project," she whispered to James, who had joined her in the search. After several tense minutes, Sophia found it, a file marked with the name of the housing development. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as she scanned the documents. There was evidence of bribes, falsified reports, and illegal land grabs, all orchestrated by Mr. Kane and his associates. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "This is what we need." But just as they were about to leave, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Sophia's heart nearly stopped as she realized that someone was coming. She and James exchanged panicked looks, their exit blocked by the approaching figure. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps drew closer. The narrow, dimly lit hallway outside the office made every creak of the approaching figure sound louder, more ominous. James quickly closed a file drawer and motioned for Sophia to stay calm. But calm was the last thing she felt. "We need to hide," James whispered urgently. He pointed to a small storage closet in the back of the room. Without hesitation, they slipped inside, pulling the door shut just in time. The office door creaked open. Through the slits of the closet door, Sophia could make out the figure of Mr. Kane, his silhouette illuminated by the faint light from the hallway. He walked into the room with an air of authority, his steps deliberate. Sophia held her breath, praying that he wouldn't notice the open drawer or the slight disarray they had left behind in their haste. She could feel James' tension beside her, both of them frozen as they watched through the small gap. Mr. Kane moved slowly toward the desk, rifling through papers, muttering something under his breath. He paused, seemingly dissatisfied, before closing the drawer with more force than necessary. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, his back to them, oblivious to the two intruders hidden just a few feet away. Finally, he gathered some files from his desk and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Sophia let out the breath she had been holding, her heart still hammering in her chest. "That was too close," James whispered, his voice shaky. Sophia nodded, her hands trembling as they emerged from the closet. They had barely escaped detection, but they had what they came for, the evidence. She tucked the file under her arm, and they slipped out of the office, locking the door behind them as quietly as possible. Once they were back in the main part of the restaurant, Sophia's mind raced with the implications of what they had just done. They had stolen incriminating documents from Mr. Kane, and if he ever found out, there would be no turning back. She had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed. James gave her a reassuring look as they parted ways. "We'll get through this, Sophia," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice matched the turmoil in her own mind. As she left the restaurant and stepped out into the cool night air, Sophia felt a rush of emotions, fear, adrenaline, and a creeping sense of dread. They had the documents, but now what? Would it be enough to stop Mr. Kane? And what would he do if he discovered that the evidence had been taken? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Senator Thompson. "I've got the documents," she said quietly when she answered. "Good," the senator replied, his voice tense. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to go through them and figure out how to proceed." Sophia hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. Tomorrow, everything could change. The next morning, Sophia felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had agreed to meet Senator Thompson at a discreet location to go over the documents, but the fear of what might happen next gnawed at her. Every step she took felt like one deeper into dangerous territory. The senator had chosen a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of the restaurant and Mr. Kane's network of informants. As Sophia entered, she saw the senator already seated at a corner table, his face drawn with worry. He motioned for her to sit, and she slid into the chair opposite him, the file clutched tightly in her hands. "You've got them?" the senator asked, his voice low. Sophia nodded, placing the file on the table between them. "Everything we need is in here. Bribery, falsified reports, illegal land grabs. It's all tied to Mr. Kane." The senator's eyes scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious with each passing page. After a long moment, he looked up at her, his face set with grim determination. "This is enough to expose him," he said, his voice hard. "But it's also going to be dangerous. Kane has powerful friends, and they're not going to take this lying down." Sophia nodded, already aware of the risks. "What do we do next?" Senator Thompson leaned back, folding his hands. "We need to make this public, but we need to do it in a way that protects you and everyone involved. If we go straight to the authorities, Kane's people will try to cover it up before we even get a chance to present the evidence. We need to be strategic." Sophia's mind raced as she considered the senator's words. "So, how do we get this out without putting ourselves at risk?" The senator looked thoughtful for a moment. "There's a journalist I trust, someone who's been working on exposing corruption for years. If we can get this to her, she can take it from there. Once it's in the public eye, Kane won't be able to stop it." Sophia felt a flicker of hope at the senator's plan, but the fear still gnawed at her. Mr. Kane was dangerous, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. But this was their best chance, perhaps their only chance, to stop him. "Okay," Sophia agreed. "Let's do it." The senator smiled slightly, a glimmer of confidence returning to his eyes. "I'll make the arrangements. In the meantime, stay under the radar. Kane might already suspect something, and we can't afford to tip him off." Sophia nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. The stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't back down now. As they parted ways, she felt the weight of the coming days press down on her. They were on the verge of exposing Mr. Kane, but the hardest part was still ahead. That evening, as Sophia returned home, the fear of what might come next settled deep in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel, that Mr. Kane would strike back with more force than she could handle. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if she had made the right decision. But deep down, she knew there was no other choice. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The following days were a whirlwind of planning and secrecy. Senator Thompson had arranged a meeting with the journalist, Lisa Matthews, a well-known investigative reporter who had a reputation for exposing corruption in the city's most powerful circles. The plan was set. Lisa would meet with them to review the documents, and from there, she would begin the process of making the evidence public. Sophia's role, for now, was to stay out of sight and let the senator and the journalist handle the next steps. But even as the plan moved forward, the tension in Sophia's life began to escalate. At the restaurant, the staff continued to avoid her, and rumors spread like wildfire. Mr. Kane hadn't returned since the night she had confronted him, but his presence lingered like a shadow over everything she did. She could feel the walls closing in, and she knew that the moment of confrontation was coming. One evening, as Sophia was finishing her shift, James pulled her aside. His expression was grim, his voice low and urgent. "I overheard something, Sophia," he said, glancing around nervously. "Kane knows something's up. He's been asking around about you, trying to figure out what you've been up to." Sophia's heart sank. What did he find out? James shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but it's not good. He's putting pressure on people, making threats. I think he's planning something." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Kane wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was actively looking for a way to destroy her. Her mind raced, trying to think of what he might do. Could he somehow sabotage their plan? Could he find a way to stop them before they could get the story out? That night, as Sophia walked home, her phone buzzed with a text message from Senator Thompson. "Meeting tomorrow with Lisa. Be careful. Kane is on to us." Sophia's stomach twisted in knots. The final showdown was approaching, and everything they had been working toward hinged on what happened next. The next morning, she met Senator Thompson and Lisa Matthews at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. Lisa was sharp-eyed and focused, flipping through the documents with the practiced precision of someone who had uncovered corruption before. Her brow furrowed as she read, occasionally asking questions, but mostly working in silence. "This is explosive," Lisa finally said, her voice serious. "There's enough here to take down Kane and half his associates. But it's not going to be easy. Once this goes public, he's going to fight back. Hard." "We're ready for that," Senator Thompson replied, though the tension in his voice was clear. Lisa nodded. "I'll need a few days to prepare the story. We have to get everything right. If we miss anything, Kane will tear it apart." Sophia felt a flicker of anxiety. They were so close now, but the risk was growing by the hour. Kane wasn't the type of man to take a blow like this without retaliating, and she knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. As they left the cafe, Sophia's mind was consumed with thoughts of what might happen once the story was released. What if Kane found out about their plan before they were ready? What if he struck first? Her fears weren't unfounded. That very evening, as Sophia was heading home, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Senator Thompson. "Kane knows. Be careful. He's coming after you." Sophia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Coming after her? What did that mean? She quickly texted back, but there was no response. Panic surged through her as she realized the gravity of the situation. Kane wasn't just trying to ruin her reputation. He was coming for her directly. She sprinted the last few blocks to her apartment, her mind racing. She had to think, had to figure out how to protect herself. But as she reached her door, she noticed something off. Her front door was slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly pushed the door open, her eyes scanning the darkened interior. The apartment was eerily silent, but the unmistakable sense of someone having been there lingered in the air. She flicked on the lights and saw it. Her apartment had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, and the few personal items she had left in disarray. Mr. Kane's message was clear. He had gotten to her home, and he wasn't done. Fear tightened in her chest as she grabbed her phone and dialed the senator. "They were here," she said breathlessly when he answered. "Someone was in my apartment." There was a long pause on the other end. "Kane's making his move. He's trying to intimidate us. We need to move quickly." Sophia's hands shook as she paced the room. "What do we do?" "I'll send someone to watch over you," the senator replied. "But the story will go live tomorrow. Once it's out, Kane won't be able to touch you without bringing more attention to himself. You just need to get through tonight." Sophia hung up, her mind whirling. She barricaded her door and sat on her bed, unable to sleep, her heart racing with every sound she heard outside. All she had to do was survive the night, but every second felt like an eternity. The next morning dawned with a sense of dread and hope mixed together. Sophia had barely slept, her mind racing with the events of the previous night. But as the sun rose, she knew the moment of truth was finally here. She sat at her kitchen table, her phone in hand, watching the minutes tick by. The story would go live any moment, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Everything they had fought for, every risk she had taken, would come down to this. At exactly 8 a.m., her phone buzzed with a notification. Lisa's story had gone live. The headline was bold, clear. "Corruption exposed. The scandal behind Mr. Kane's development deals." Sophia's heart raced as she opened the article, her eyes scanning the text. Lisa had laid everything out: the bribes, the falsified reports, the illegal land grabs. It was all there, in black and white, for the world to see. Senator Thompson was quoted throughout the article, backing up the evidence with his own statements. There was no way Kane could deny it now. Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage, and news outlets began picking up the story. Kane's name was everywhere, and the public backlash was immediate. People demanded investigations, arrests, and justice for the communities Kane had tried to destroy. Sophia watched it all unfold, a strange sense of relief washing over her. They had done it. The truth was out, and Kane's empire was crumbling before her eyes. Her phone rang, and she saw Senator Thompson's name flash across the screen. She answered, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and relief. "We did it," the senator said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Kane's going down. The authorities are already opening an investigation. It's only a matter of time before they bring him in." Sophia smiled, a weight lifting off her shoulders. "I can't believe it's finally over." "It's not over yet," the senator warned. "Kane's going to fight back. He's not going to go quietly. But we've dealt the first blow, and it's a big one." Sophia nodded, knowing that while the battle might not be completely over, the hardest part was behind them. Kane's power was broken, and the truth had won out in the end. That evening, as Sophia walked through the city, the air felt lighter, as though the dark cloud that had hung over her life for so long was finally beginning to lift. She passed by a group of people huddled around their phones, reading the story that had changed everything. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The victory had come at a cost: her safety, her job, her sense of normalcy, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had stood up to a powerful man, risked everything to expose the truth, and in the end, she had won. Mr. Kane's empire was collapsing, and the community he had tried to destroy would be saved. As she walked, she realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, more corruption to fight, but now she knew she had the strength to face them. The fallout from the expose spread faster than Sophia could have ever anticipated. Within days, Mr. Kane's empire, once thought to be untouchable, began to unravel. Public outcry mounted as more news outlets picked up Lisa Matthews' story, each digging deeper into the corrupt web of lies Cain had spun. The authorities launched an official investigation, and the weight of the evidence was too overwhelming for even his most powerful allies to protect him. Cain tried to fight back, of course. He hired high-profile lawyers and launched a media campaign to discredit the article, accusing Senator Thompson and Sophia of conspiring against him for personal gain. But it didn't work. The truth was out, and no matter how hard Cain tried to twist the narrative, people saw through his desperate attempts to deflect blame. More whistleblowers came forward, employees from his company, and former partners who had been quietly silenced over the years. It wasn't long before the legal system caught up with him. Within a week of the story breaking, Cain was arrested on charges of fraud, bribery, and illegal land dealings. It was a swift fall from grace, and the once powerful businessman was now facing years in prison. Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as she watched the news report on his arrest. Justice was being served, and the people who had been threatened, displaced, and manipulated by his greed were finally getting the vindication they deserved. But as the dust settled, Sophia found herself standing at a crossroads. For weeks, her life had revolved around the fight to bring down Cain, but now that it was over, she felt an odd emptiness. The adrenaline that had fueled her was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. Her phone rang one afternoon, breaking the silence of her apartment. It was Senator Thompson. "How are you holding up?" the senator asked, his voice warm and concerned. "I'm okay," Sophia replied, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "It's strange. Everything happened so fast, and now it's just quiet." The senator chuckled softly. "That's the way it goes. But listen, I've been thinking. You did something incredible, Sophia. You stood up when no one else would, and you've got the potential to do more." Sophia sat up, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've been approached by a group of activists, people who work to expose corruption and fight for justice in underprivileged communities. They need someone with your tenacity, someone who's not afraid to take on the powerful. I know it's a lot to think about, but I think you'd be perfect for the job." Sophia's heart raced. The idea of continuing this kind of work excited her, but it also terrified her. She had risked everything to bring down Cain, and the thought of diving into a world of constant battles and danger was daunting. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the sense of purpose it gave her. She had seen firsthand what corruption could do, and now she had a chance to make a real difference. "I'll need some time to think about it," she said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Of course," Senator Thompson replied. "Take all the time you need. But know this, Sophia, you've already proven yourself. Whatever you decide, you've got people in your corner now." They said their goodbyes, and Sophia sat for a long time after the call, staring out her window, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had spent so much of her life feeling powerless, like a bystander in her own story. But now, things were different. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and she had won. The scars of the fight were still there, emotional, professional, but the victory was hers. That evening, Sophia went for a walk, the cool breeze of the city wrapping around her like a blanket of comfort. As she passed by a group of people reading the latest update on Mr. Cain's trial, she couldn't help but feel proud of what she had done. She had stood up to a man many feared, and in doing so, she had changed the course of lives. There was a new confidence in her steps, a certainty that whatever came next, she could handle it. The fear that had once gripped her no longer held sway over her decisions. She was ready for the next chapter, whether that meant working with the activists or carving out her own path. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never let herself be silenced again. Sophia returned home that night, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. The world still had its challenges, its injustices, but she had learned that one voice, her voice, could make a difference. And she was ready to use it. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a message from James. "You're a hero, Sophia. The world needs more people like you." She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. The world did need more people willing to fight, and now she knew she was one of them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us out. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let us know what part of the story had the biggest impact on you. Was it Sophia's bold decision, the intense showdown with Mr. Kane, or the final moment of justice? Also, if you have any story ideas or themes you'd like to see on the channel, feel free to share them. Your suggestions inspire us to bring you more compelling content. See you in the next story.